Good morning, and thanks for calling into my webinar on cause, effects, and expectations of oversupply in the CAISO market. This is actually the second time I'm doing this webinar this morning. The first time, unfortunately, we had 1 million beeps on the system, so you guys are lucky you don't have to put up with that. So just some housekeeping. If there are any reporters on the line, I don't think there are on this one, but just in case, I can be on the record, but if anyone else happens to speak on this call, they are off the record. And of course, the views expressed are my own and do not represent any client or the Western Power Trading Forum. So the Western Power Trading Forum is a nonprofit membership organization dedicated to encouraging competition in the Western states electric market. Most of you probably have heard of WPTF already. Most of you are probably members. My relationship with the WPTF is that I run the CAISO committee. I like to think of the CAISO committee as having the tagline, working together to improve market policy and transparency. Practically, what it means when I run the CAISO committee is that I'm deeply involved in CAISO policy and CAISO operations. So that's how most people know me, is because I advocate for WPTF in different forums at the CAISO. I am a consultant, however. I work for Rosero Consulting. The founder and CEO is Ellen Wolf. If you're interested in more details about my life, that's my LinkedIn information, and you could just stalk me on the internet like a normal person. The reason why I'm giving this seminar is because I've heard a lot of questions, initially from WPTF members and from my clients, and now there just seems to be questions at every meeting I go to about oversupply. I bucket these questions into 3 different areas. I hear a lot of questions on price. This tends to be from storage developers, asset managers, EIM entities. And then I get some questions on contracts. This has to do with renewable. These questions are from renewable asset owners, load serving entities, CCAs. And then I hear a lot of questions about reliability. People don't specifically ask me about reliability, but it seems like PTOs, regulatory agencies, everyone cares if the lights stay on. And then I get a few questions over and over again. One question I get very frequently is, what effect does EIM have on oversupply, and why does EIM help or alleviate oversupply concerns more than just import? And I'm going to talk about that in this presentation. Another question I get is about policies. I deal a lot in the policy world, so what policies could help alleviate oversupply conditions? And then an interesting one I get is oversupply a bad thing? It's a very interesting question to me. I don't think oversupply is a bad thing, but I think we need to be careful when we talk about oversupply exactly what we mean by that. So when we get into our presentation outline, one of the first things I'm going to do is define oversupply. So part 1 is what I've dubbed cause and effect. We're going to go over the market optimization rules and what exactly oversupply means, and then talk about how CAISO market rules impact prices and contracts. Don't worry, it's not a trap. I have not convinced you all to sign up for this webinar just so I could talk to you about the market optimization. Although I would love to do that all day, I won't. We'll very quickly move into the second part, which is about expectations and breaking down what exactly is going on today on the grid, and how that's impacting prices, and talking about what will happen going forward. At the end of this presentation, my hope is that you'll get comfortable, or at least more comfortable, with how the ISO is handling oversupply. Even if right now you're thinking, I don't really care about part 1, I think you do care, because how the ISO rules handle oversupply ultimately will drive price and how negative the prices are. It'll drive contracts, and may end up being the difference between you winning or losing a contract dispute. And then finally, how the CAISO operates and manages oversupply determines whether our lights stay on. So I think we really care about part 1. So what is oversupply? Is it supply greater than demand across the CAISO grid? No, right? Like that would be too easy. I think of oversupply, and I think we could generally define oversupply as oversupply conditions reflect a situation where resources that are willing to give away their energy for free, or resources that are willing to pay you to keep being able to generate energy are dispatched downward. So if these resources that are giving it away for free or even willing to pay to generate energy can't do that and aren't allowed to generate energy, well, that's an oversupply condition. The next question we could ask, and I think it's really important, is how is oversupply measured? So the CAISO reports, and I think it reports every day on renewable curtailment. And I'm going to talk a lot about curtailment in this presentation, but I want to note that curtailment is not an industry standard word, and there's no industry standard definition for curtailment. And there's been lawsuits and some issues across the country over this one simple word, curtailment. So I want to be very clear that when I talk about curtailment and renewable curtailment in this presentation, I mean very specifically how the CAISO defines curtailment. And the CAISO defines renewable curtailment as the difference between actual production and the forecast when actual production is less than the forecast. Practically what that means is that if a renewable resource is not generating as much as they physically are able to, they're considered to be curtailed. So I've just pulled this table below is from the ISO's Renewable Curtailment Report, and I'm not going to go through it. I just want to call your attention to what's available and what they report on, and then note at the bottom you can see these 6 different colored bars, and they are a little bit difficult to see, let alone understand. For example, the dark blue bar says self-sched cut -local. Now the ISO on different pages of the report, and this is just a copy paste of that report, it goes into these 6 different categories. So you could see, for example, that self-sched cut -local is defined as market dispatch of self-schedules to mitigate local congestion. My hope is by the end of this, by the end of this presentation or end of the section even, you'll understand each of these and you'll understand how they impact prices. And so when you hear things like, oh, there are local self-schedule cuts, you'll understand the price implication of that and the difference between a price expectation from a local self-schedule cut and an economic system cut. So let's move into translating this into English. So the market optimization, the big computer that controls the ISO grid, will curtail wind and solar resources that either have economic bids in the market or self-scheduled, so they're price takers. So these are considered economic or self-scheduled curtailment. So it's important to remember now, the market optimization does all economic and self-scheduled curtailment. Exceptional dispatch curtailment, those are done by CAISO operators. The CAISO operator can actually pick up the phone or enter a number into their system and send an electronic dispatch. So the difference isn't whether a resource receives the communication electronically or on the phone. The difference between an economic and self-scheduled curtailment and an exceptional dispatch curtailment is who made the decision to curtail the wind or solar resource. So if the market optimization made the decision, that's an economic or self-scheduled curtailment. If a human being made the decision, that's an exceptional dispatch curtailment. I want to do a quick overview on the market optimization. I know many of you know this already, but I feel just a need to level set a little bit here. The market optimization essentially is just a giant cost minimization problem that ensures supply meets demand at the lowest cost, subject to thousands of constraints. You could have big global constraints, like ensuring supply and demand meet, or you could have more individual constraints. An example of an individual constraint would be the fact that generators have to remain online for 6 hours once they're turned on, right? So when the optimization is solving this giant cost minimization problem, it knows if it turns that generator on, it has to keep it on for 6 hours. And that's why there are just thousands upon thousands of constraints. But ultimately, it's just a giant math problem. And the thing about math is math needs numbers. And this gets to be really important when you start talking about curtailment. So the optimization manages congestion using economic offers. And so a resource can provide their value to the optimization by putting in a bid. Or the optimization will use an assigned parameter cost, or what's called a penalty factor. So a lot of people get weirded out by the term penalty factor because penalty sounds like a bad thing. It's not. It's purely a math term. So don't think of penalty factor as something negative. Just think of it as math term indicating assigned value. Many of you probably heard me speak when I used to work at the California ISO. If you did, you'll know that most of my presentations are filled with pictures. This one is no different. So most people are really comfortable with the green bars. The green bars show the light green bar is from -150 to 0, and then the dark green bar is 0 to 1,000. Most people are comfortable with the fact that people can make energy offers between -150 and 1,000. Where people are less comfortable is what happens beneath this. So even if a resource does not economically offer into the market, that resource still has value. It still has value to the reliability. It still has value to the market systems. That resource value, however, because it's not indicated by its bid, the optimization, again, because it's just a giant math problem, it needs a number. It needs a way to value that resource that's self-scheduled in compared to any other resource. So the way the ISO does that is through penalty factors. How this relates to curtailment then is you could see that economic curtailment is on these green bars. For the positive, the green bars, economic curtailment is all the way from positive 1,000 to -150. Anywhere in there is considered economic curtailment. Self-scheduled curtailment now happens within these penalty parameter values. And I'll get into exactly what the penalty parameter value is, but first it's just important to note why we're even talking about it. And we're talking about it because if you do a self-scheduled curtailment, you're now into penalty factors. So what I'm going to do is just focus on this dark area, and I'm going to blow it up really big so we can talk, not dark area. So see the circle area? I'm going to blow that up really big. Here we go. So the first penalty factor I have here starts at -155, which is actually less than the bid floor. That's the power balance constraint. Below that, you then get into two different self-schedule types. And in the real-time market, the ISO assigns different values to different types of self-schedule. So the first type of self-schedule is what the ISO calls a price taker supply bid. Essentially, this is a real-time self-schedule. This is a wind resource that has not offered into the day-ahead market that has come into real-time and put in a self-schedule. And so that's the first category of self-schedule. The second category is what the ISO calls an IFM schedule. Really, though, what they mean by that is they mean a resource that has an IFM schedule that hasn't touched it, and so it's become a real-time self-schedule. And the reason why it's become a real-time self-schedule is simply because that's a market rule. The way the ISO has set up the optimization is that if you have an IFM schedule and you don't re-offer it into the real-time economically, it just becomes a self-schedule. So those IFM schedules that have become self-schedules are a different class and have a self-schedule than just real-time self-schedules, and they're protected under a different penalty factor. So essentially, what that means is when the ISO is in oversupply and it has run through its entire economic stack, so if you think back here, the ISO needs to cut supply, and it's already cut every economic bid it can, well, then it has to start cutting resources that are protected and have penalty factor values. So what does it cut first? Well, you could see that these real-time self-schedules have a -$400 penalty price, whereas the IFM schedules have a -$750 penalty price. So what that means is that real-time self-schedules get cut first. So a question I've gotten several times is how does the ISO decide which self-schedule to cut? You know, you could have thousands of megawatts in this bucket, but the ISO probably won't need to cut thousands of megawatts. Maybe it needs to cut hundreds. So who does the ISO pick? Well, even at this point, it's still done by the market optimization, and it's still just cost minimization and math. So the market optimization essentially will decide based on effectiveness factor which resource to curtail. Imagine then you have two resources in the same place, or have the same, for whatever reason, happen to have the identical effectiveness factor. Well, at that point in time, they probably have different losses, and that would give a different economic value. Only if two resources have the same effectiveness factor and the same losses, then will the market optimization, essentially they'll just randomly pick a resource to curtail. For whatever reason, the ISO calls this a pro rata curtailment, but in reality, it's random. The market optimization one day may pick one resource and another day may pick another. So now how does that relate to prices? There's some confusion that people have is that self-schedule is protected by -400 or -750 under this penalty factor, that they don't see prices go to low. And that's because when you end up curtailing a self-schedule, even though the optimization uses these penalty factors to value the relative value of, position of the resources, that's not actually the price. The price ends up still being -150. So that's what's illustrated on this chart. So if you curtail a resource between 1,000 and -150, it'll be whatever that resource's cost is, essentially, right? It'll be the marginal unit, and that'll be the energy price. If you curtail a self-schedule, well, then the price is automatically -150. Practically, though, what we have seen this spring is that resources that are being economically curtailed are somehow leading the price to be between -$5 and -$25. I might, if we have time, get into exactly why that is at the end of the presentation, but it's just at a high level, if you have an economic curtailment, you can expect prices to be between $5 and $25. If you have a self-schedule curtailment, the price will be around $150. So the other differentiation between curtailment, so you have economic and self-schedule, then the other two categories you had were local and system. So system curtailment implies an excess of supply across the entire system. That means there is no demand anywhere that can take the supply. Local curtailment, on the other hand, implies that there's transmission congestion somewhere, and therefore supply can't reach the demand. And because local and system have very different definitions, as you can imagine, local and system curtailment have very different impacts on price. So they both have different impacts on price functionally. In the LMP, I'm going to talk about that. But then also, as a preview, they have very different implications on the depth of the price, or how negative the price will go. So if you guys remember, LMP equals energy plus congestion plus losses. So when you talk about a system curtailment, this will show up in the energy component of the LMP. When you talk about a local curtailment, this will show up in the congestion component of the LMP. And I'm going to walk through local curtailment and the impacts that has and its relationship to the penalty factors over the next few slides. So this is an extremely simplified example. I want to caveat that this is not an LMP class. This is not exactly correct. I'm just trying to illustrate local curtailment sufficiently so you understand its impact on prices. So let's assume that past 26, that transmission line is constrained. Typically just assume a 45% effectiveness factor on the north and a 55% effectiveness factor on the south, and that the system marginal energy cost is $0. Let's also assume for ease that there are no losses and that the penalty parameter on that transmission constraint is $1,000. So what does that mean for prices? So if you were just talking about energy and congestion and ignoring losses, well, I already said the system marginal energy cost is 0, and that's assumption, right? It could be $10. It could be anything. That's just a number I picked out of the air. So now let's think about the LMP in the south. So the LMP in the south is $0 plus -55% times 1,000, right? Because that penalty price has is impacting the South by that 55% effectiveness factor. So that's negative $550. So the LMP, because of congestion, is negative $550. But we don't calculate LMPs in isolation, right? LMPs and the penalty prices are in this huge optimization. So the optimization is always making trade-offs. And if you notice, negative $550 is less than the penalty price we said was for the price taker's supply bids. So that means if you have congestion that's leading to a little less than $550 price, you'll actually end up cutting self-schedules in a local area. So when you hear that there are self-schedule cuts in a local area, this doesn't mean anything is wrong. It doesn't mean there's a reliability issue. It doesn't mean anything inefficient is going on. It simply means the optimization is working as expected. That's one component that I hear again and again from people, or a concern I suppose I hear, is what does it mean if there is deeply negative prices in a local area? Does that mean we have reliability issue? And I just want to emphasize that it doesn't necessarily mean it. It could simply mean that the optimization is working as intended, and you're going to see negative prices in local areas, especially in gen pockets. Okay, so thank you for hanging with me for the market optimization piece. We are very close to getting into the fun part. I have one more slide. Oh, there we go. And it's on contract implications. I just want to touch on this briefly. I review a fair bit of renewable contracts, and they vary significantly across organizations and actually even more so across time. So the different vintages of renewable contracts seem to vary even more than the 10 different contracts signed by 10 different companies, all in the same year. So most contracts I've seen don't distinguish payment by ISO-defined curtailment type. Instead, they use more generalized language. So this generalized language, though, can introduce some contract risk. For example, language that says they will pay you for a market curtailment, but not pay a resource, they'll pay a resource for a market curtailment, but not pay a resource for reliability curtailment. Well, what does that mean? If you go back here, where is the market curtailment and where is the reliability curtailment? At what point do you consider a curtailment needed for reliability? It could be that no curtailment done by the optimization should be considered a reliability curtailment. Other people may argue that once you start getting to the bottom of these self-schedules, and maybe that last resource that's curtailed, well, they're really doing that for reliability because they are trying to turn off everything they possibly can. So this is, I want to avoid legal future trouble. And I want to say I don't necessarily believe what I just said, that is a reliability curtailment. It may be, it may not be, it depends on your contract. We need to talk about it more. I think what I can say very clearly, though, is there is no bright line right now on what a reliability curtailment is beyond Overgeneration Procedure 2390. And that this does introduce some contract risk, and my free advice to everyone is that this is an issue. You should review your contract, and you should probably get the CAISO to clean up their language to reduce this risk. Because when you have risk, it increases prices, and that's not necessarily a good thing. Okay, so implications recap. So hopefully by now you see the difference between a local curtailment and a system curtailment, the difference between a self-schedule curtailment and an economic curtailment. And I hope more than that you get a feel for the ability of a local curtailment to have a much more negative price than, for example, a system economic one. So when you start hearing things, oh, there are a lot of local curtailments, or, oh, no, the ISO is simply doing system economic curtailments, you'll understand what that means in terms of prices. The other thing I hope that you've taken away from this first part is that, you know, the ISO is managing things in an efficient, reliable manner. Everything has been, so far, pretty good, and the market optimization has been able to handle things in oversupply conditions. So simply because you have curtailment, that does not imply any inefficiency or any necessarily reliability risk on the system. It could just mean that the market is operating in a functional, efficient manner. Okay, here's the part that I think people will be more interested in, our expectations for the future, and honestly, the most of this presentation is what's going on right now. And by right now, I mean in the past week, I think is where most of my data comes from. So the previous section illustrated complexity of determining the impact of oversupply on the CAISO market. The rest of the presentation is much more high level. I could, and I considered presenting more detailed analyses, but you get in the weeds really fast. If you want to talk about predicting negative prices going forward, you have to think about things like the depth of the economic bid stack. How many, that is, how many renewable resources are economically bidding in versus self-scheduling, right? And I hope, because you listened to my part one, you understand why that matters for price forecasting. You also have to do a pretty detailed assessment by each local area, and then you have to forecast this going forward. So you can do price predictions for negative prices just as easily or not as easily as you can for non-negative prices, but it does involve, I think, just a little bit more work. So the expectation factors I'm going to talk about going forward is I'm going to talk about load, and specifically behind the meter solar build out. I'm not going to actually talk about net load that much, although I will mention it, of course. Then I'm going to talk about the supply stack. In general, I think you can get the best average information from the CAISO. So if you're talking about needing monthly averages for the past 5 years, there's no better source than the CAISO itself to get that data. If you want specific up-to-date information, you have to pay someone to get that. So we use Energy GPS, and they very nicely have let us use a lot of their data for this webinar. So going forward in this section, if I'm showing you average data, that's from the CAISO, specifically from a WSPP presentation by Mark Rothleader. It was nice, let me use the slides, and a presentation to the EIM board. If it's detailed data, again, that's Energy GPS, and specifically from a WSPP presentation by Jeff, and Energy GPS newsletter, which is free, by the way, and reports. So actually, Energy GPS, I might have this later in my presentation too, but they put out a free newsletter. So you can actually go to their website and sign up for that newsletter. I don't think it's as good as Gary Ackerman's Burrito, but it's pretty good and it's interesting, and I enjoy reading it. Okay, so talking about load. So distributed solar by itself is having a significant impact on the load curve. There is a lot of talk about the net load curve and, of course, the duck curve. But if you just look at load itself, it is creating its own duck. So this picture, orange, is 2013. The gray line is 2017. And you could see, so for those of you who don't live and breathe the duck, this is the belly of the duck. And see, and this is the head, and you can kind of see the beak. So what you could see here from just these two data points is that the load curve itself is beginning to look more like the net load curve, and is beginning to have its own duck shape. So if you look at the data behind this, you'll see that behind the meter solar, specifically rooftop solar build out in the CAISO, is exponentially growing. So we went in 2013 from having about 2,000 megawatts of behind the meter solar to 2017 having 6,600. And the prediction for 2020 is that there's going to be almost 12,000 megawatts of rooftop solar. I think that's amazing, right? I think you could use this data and build out a pretty cool load duck curve. And I think that actually has more challenges than a net load duck curve. And the reason why is because when you're managing a net load ramp, you have full visibility into solar and wind that's causing that steep ramp. Yes, there may be some solar or wind forecasting errors, but as much as possible, you have that data. When you're talking about a load duct curve and you're trying to manage going from the belly of the duct to the peak, and you don't have insight into where that solar is exactly and what is causing those distribution resources to move around or be uncertain, then your load forecasting is very, very challenging, and you have more trouble setting up your resource stack to meet the head of the duct. So I think as we move forward, of course, we still have to talk about the net load curve, but I think the increased variability and uncertainty caused by the load curve will become more important to talk about. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about is imports. So for a long time, and many of you may have heard me say this multiple times, I have been trying to get the ISO to lower their bid floor, because I've said, hey, look at these imports. You have thousands upon thousands of megawatts importing into California. At the same time, you're having renewable curtailment. That's probably not ideal. Maybe we should try and incent these imports to do different things. So when I've made these speeches historically, though, I haven't actually dug into the data. So recently, I've been digging more into exactly what's underlying these imports. By that, I mean, what's the generation behind these imports? What regions exactly are they from? How price responsive are they? And what are their underlying contract structures? So I'm going to present a little bit on some of that research I found. So this shows knob and tacky, and you could see that they're not shaping very well. By that, I mean they're not price responsive, and in the middle of the day when the prices are negative, they're still importing in pretty flat. So what that means is that they're forcing the CAISO optimization to make a trade-off between imports and renewables. And if you remember those penalty factors I showed you before, well, imports are protected by a much, much lower penalty factor than self-schedules even. So the ISO is going to essentially cut all internal renewables before it's going to start cutting imports. So you could see knob and packy are pretty flat, and then you can compare this to other imports, and this is mostly Desert Southwest imports. And you can see that Desert Southwest, on the other hand, is responding to CAISO price signals and is extremely shaping their import capacity. I think it's interesting to compare this to thermal generation. Thermal generation gets a lot of flack sometimes for self-scheduling in, for having to run at PMIN, right? God forbid a thermal generator run at PMIN in the middle of the day so it can ramp up later. But I think they get some flack. But I think imports are really more of a driver. If you look, for example, on this day, if you look at overall imports now, so putting Desert Southwest and everyone else, and packy and knob on top of each other, you'll see that okay, overall they both have they both contribute to the evening ramp, so that's great. But that imports actually are causing a higher burden on the system in the middle of the day than thermal generators are. So I think what that says from a policy perspective is that maybe there should be focus on understanding imports more and trying to drive those middle of the day imports into the system down instead of focusing on thermal generation quite as much. So this is a big fat slide, right? You're probably thinking, oh my God, that's way too much information. And I know, and you know what? It's not even all the information I wanted to present. I also would have loved to have internal CAISO wind on here, but I'll just have to speak to it instead. So what I want to talk about for the next little bit is wind. I don't think wind gets talked about nearly enough. Everyone talks about hydro these days, but to me, wind is the big story. So I'm going to go through what I'm dubbing a wind and solar trade-off. Okay, so first, let's just start at the top and work our way down. So this is last week. So this is energy GPS data. And you could see the top is curtailed megawatt hours, and this is solar. This chart would show you if the CAISO curtailed wind, and it did not. It just curtailed solar. And then the next line is CAISO renewables, but by that I just mean wind and solar in the day ahead in real time. So the green line is the day ahead renewable forecast for wind and solar, and the yellow area is the actual wind and solar in real time. Okay, the next two are Pacific Northwest BPA flows. So these are just all BPA flows across Knob and Paki. So that means that it's coming into California, but not necessarily California ISO, because entities like LADWP and SMUD still have rights on those lines. So I think you could probably assume 3/4 of this is flowing into the CAISO, and just based on comparing this to comparing ISO data, we know that the shape is about the same. So, CAISO imports don't look, way more price responsive than ones flowing into LADWP or anything like that. The next is BPA wind in real time, and what this is just wind being generated in the Pacific Northwest. So this is not wind directly going into the CAISO necessarily, but how it relates to that is when there's a high wind day in the Pacific Northwest, essentially that fills up any transmission capacity that you might have, and it fills it up more than you would expect for the prices. By that I mean, if you look at the 20th, even though you have deeply negative prices, you still end up with flows into California at 4,800 megawatts, 1,000 megawatts more than the day before. And this has to do with this significant amount of wind being generated in BPA that just has to go somewhere, right? So a lot of it ends up flowing into the CAISO. Well, the next two compares, so you have the top, which is imports, the blue, which is imports, and now we're going to talk about EIM flows. So the purple is the Desert Southwest EIM flows, and the gray is the Pac West EIM flows. And you can see on days like the 20th, where you have curtailment, where you have curtailment, and on days, let's see, on 4/23, where you have curtailment, you see significant amounts of energy flowing into the other EIM areas. And that's what you want to have happen. That's good. People have asked, so what's the difference between EIM and imports? Is there any difference? And so the main thing to remember is that if you're already in an oversupply period, so if it's the real time and you're in a 5-minute oversupply and you need to curtail someone, you can't curtail an import. Imports at best are 15 minutes movable, but you can move an EIM flow because EIM is optimized in 5 minutes. So that additional incremental ability to move energy onto a different EIM entity in that 5 minutes significantly helps reduce internal CAISO curtailment compared to that 15-minute ability to cut an import or have a price responsive import. And generally though, if you take a step back and you're not in that oversupply condition, both EIM and imports will generically impact the grid the same way. If you had perfect forecasting, a price responsive import bid would be just as good as a price responsive EIM bid. It's only once you're in the oversupply condition, you're in that 5 minutes, that EIM really helps you more than an import. Okay, so back to this graph. So you see though that the ISO is relying for the most part on the Desert Southwest and PAC to take the excess energy when there is a lot of solar on the system and the ISO is curtailing solar. And then putting it all together, you see the prices. So the red line is prices in the day ahead, the blue area is prices in real time, and naturally, as you would expect, you see negative prices whenever there is solar curtailment. Also, as expected, you don't see significant low negative prices, it's still within that, -5-ish to -$25 range. Because you do have a -$4.20 on 4/21. But I think that's within the realm of expectation. Okay, so my overall concluding point about here is that when you take a step back and you look at what's happening on the grid, and each day has its own unique story, and of course it has to do with the amount of import capability and transmission constraints. But if you look at it from a big picture, you see on days that there are a lot of Pacific Northwest wind, or on the 19th, for example, here, if I could show you CAISO wind, there was a lot of CAISO wind blowing on this day. Those days where the trade-off is between wind and solar, wind will win every time. Solar will always be the one that's curtailed, and for whatever reason, it tends to be that because above average wind or extra wind is really hard to forecast, that the day-ahead market isn't doing a really good job at setting up the resources so they can prevent curtailment in real time. That is, the day-ahead market isn't seeing this wind for whatever reason, so it doesn't know it's there, so it puts online too many resources, or it can't set up the resource stack to be sufficiently flexible so that when the wind shows up in real time, both the wind and solar get to blow, or both the wind and solar get to generate. So again, wind and solar trade-off, and not just internal wind and solar trade-off, essentially wherever the wind is, whether it's internal to the CAISO or it's in the Pacific Northwest, that at least in April has been a significant driver of solar curtailment. So, okay, wait, what about hydro? So of course hydro matters. So before I get into the chart, just very generally, hydro matters for two reasons. One, it matters internally, right? It is often a resource that is not as price responsive as you would hope. And then two, it has the same effect as wind in the Pacific Northwest, where it ends up, filling the transmission lines and getting imported in. So on days where you have high hydro and high wind, that's when you're going to see a lot of solar curtailment. That said, hydro is not as big of a story as I think people thought it might be. So what this chart shows is it shows hydro production in blue and solar production in yellow. And that red dotted line is simply me showing you what February 2006 levels were of hydro, so you can compare it to February 2017. Again, this is average data, so I got this from the CAISO. They showed this at an EIM presentation a few weeks ago. So what you see is that even though we're the wettest California on record, and hydro is certainly back, we're still not producing, and hydro is still not on the system as much as it was back in 2006. And you could also see over the past couple of years that solar really has displaced hydro, or maybe not displaced because we've been in drought conditions, but it really has filled in where hydro used to be. So now let's look at the past week, and I apologize, this is a very poor quality graph, and I should have created a new one, but I didn't. So the blue is 2016, the yellow is 2017, and what you see is even though 2016 was a much worse hydro year, 2017 and the past few days haven't looked that much different. And especially when you look on a day where we just talked about, like 420, that had significant oversupply, you see that the peak hydro on the system is not that different between 2017 and 2016. So the reasons for this vary day to day, but at a macro level, a lot of hydro is choosing to spill in response to negative prices. So unlike hydro previously, which hasn't been that price responsive, we actually are seeing more and more price responsive hydro where they won't generate at negative prices. And then the other reason just in the past few days is because of Orville Dam, unfortunately. So there's still some issues there. So they're spilling rather than generating on the system. So my big takeaway for the last few slides is hydro matters. I don't think hydro is the story of the year. I think if you want to look into details, people should really start focusing more on wind. Okay, so let's put this all together. So you care about how much each of these resource types are generating in any hour, because ultimately that's what leads to renewable curtailment. So I'm just showing you, this is an example of real-time curtailment. It's just one of the stock examples that the CAISO uses. But I like it because it represents an actual day, but it also is a very indicative day. So if you look at what's going on, you see thermal, it's fairly consistent across the day and then increases during the evening ramp. Same with hydro, it increases a little bit. And then you see imports. And you see imports are actually a little bit shaped, right? So they decrease toward the middle of the day and then they increase. However, and we see this again and again, imports don't ramp to their lowest point of the day fast enough, at least fast enough for California solar. So many times in the morning when the sun begins to shine and imports are ramping down, so everyone is starting to respond to prices, that's where you get renewable curtailment. That's why I like this chart. The next chart is an example of day-ahead curtailment. The CAISO doesn't put together data on this yet, I think because it hasn't been an issue, but for the first time ever, I think, since the CAISO market started, we're seeing negative prices in the day ahead, which is really good in my opinion. And by good, I mean from a market efficiency perspective and from keeping the day ahead aligned with the real time. It's a good thing in that way. So here is a simplified day ahead chart. I say simplified because I didn't include things like virtuals, and so I had to adjust for that. But you see that the day ahead resource stack looks a little bit different than real time. And I think more investigation should go into this, because if the day ahead resource mix is looking significantly different than real time, then that'll impact which resources you will curtail and the magnitude of resources you'll end up curtailing. On this day, the ISO did end up curtailing in the day ahead and having negative prices, across the board from hours, 10 through 16, which is pretty amazing when you think about it, because the day ahead market, it's just an hourly market and it doesn't have very many constraints. So most of the time you can align your resource stack so you don't have to curtail solar. But more and more you're seeing that just isn't true anymore. Okay, so there's a lot of data that I just presented to you. If you're interested in where things are going, not just what's going on right now, I have a recommendation for you. So first, I have a very blunt caveat. There are a lot of just terrible reports out there by consulting companies. And I know I'm a consultant, so maybe I shouldn't say this, but I read some of these reports on oversupply, and they're just not good. But so this report is really good. It is not one of those crappy other reports. This report has actual data and justifies every, I would say, every expectation or forecast that they make is actually justified by the data. And they don't just say, hey, it's been growing by 2% for the last 5 years. Let's grow it by 2% next year. So it's really in depth. And if you're interested in that, at the end of this slide deck, I have contact information for them. And they also, I should add, have other types of products they sell. So if you're actually interested in data and way more data than I just presented, they have products where you can get access to that data. So a review of this presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. So first, the market optimization and therefore economics dictate both economic and self-schedule curtailment in system and local areas. And I know that's a mouthful, but what I really mean by that is I hope you understand how the market optimization works and how it's an economic decision even in self-scheduled local curtailment periods. The next thing I hope that you understand is that different types of curtailment impact prices differently, and that there are some contractual implications to how curtailment is defined. And then finally, and this is more for people who think about policy, but the majority of energy put onto the CAISO system is price responsive, and the market optimization seems to be working optimally. Therefore, things like incentives and market rules really matter. If curtailments are almost entirely driven by economics, the rules that impact those economics then are really important. So if you want to reduce curtailment, or you want to influence which resources are curtailed, well, you do that through economics, and you do that through really solid market rules. Okay. So finally, a little bit more about Energy GPS. Again, this is not my consulting company. I work at Rosero, but since they did provide all the data, I thought I should actually tell you where the data came from. Again, they have this really cool report. It's California Renewable Oversupply. Contact them if you're interested, or email me and I could pass along your request to them. This is where I had the free newsletter. Yeah, they have a free newsletter. I don't think it's as good as the burrito. Gary Ackerman cannot be topped. However, it's much shorter. So it's a quick, just daily article covering an interesting topic. And then they have packages of data for West Power Gas and the California Tracker. I personally have been really involved in their California Tracker and read that daily. I think it is daily, and have not seen their gas one, but have heard good things. Okay, well, thank you, everyone, and I will take Q&A now.